Welcome back. Welcome to another episode of Nain Shorts, where we talk training. How do we become better martial artists or just better people in general? Well, I guess martial arts is a good segue into becoming better people. Under the right mindset, of course. Not everybody shares the same ideals, but I believe we all do want to improve or at least continue growing in the art that we practice or just in general. Um, and that's really what I wanted to talk about today is this idea of the martial arts and who we are as individuals because of it. Now, I know it's a big part of my life. I don't know for some of you who just do it on weekends, some of you just like there's different people and doing it for different reasons, but for me it's about constant improvement as a practitioner as well as an instructor at this point. And having the opportunity to meet so many different instructors, you get so many ideas that come with it. And just recently went to a seminar orchestrated by our good friend Dennis Duarte at, is it Kakua? Martial arts in Pleasanton, and it was a great time. It was just Ron Saturno. If you don't know who he is, please look him up. Great practitioner of Serrata, trained under Angel Cabales, and he has a lot of great ideas in reference to training and cross training, and is a big advocate of that. If you missed it, sorry, there will be other events coming up. For example, our good friend Mike Cardenas is having his one of two big VEA martial art events in Manteca coming in April, and then I believe Kaku is also hosting another event orchestrated by Dennis Duarte in June. So keep an eye out for those things. There are great ways to learn and share and get just exposed to different arts and different mentalities. Because ultimately, that's where you're going to find what works for you. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you won't know whether or not that is what's best for you. And getting exposed this way allows you to take bits of it and then figure out what is there, what's out there, what's available. Because sometimes that's what we need. We need that exposure to figure out what works for us. And the thing about it is that something Ron said in reference to cross training, like you need a good base. And I couldn't agree more with him. You need a base of some knowledge, something that you can work off of and then expose to other things. You can bring it back and say, this works for me, this doesn't work for me. I like it though, but it's just not something that's going to work with my body type. And the question for me would be, when do you in your journey branch out? When do you take the time to say, okay, I know enough of this one thing that I can now start exploring others? Because there's a lot to be said about the process of learning and how we go about doing so. If we get so caught up in doing something one way, it becomes a habit. But does that necessarily mean that that habit is what's best for us? And how does it hinder our future growth? Now, I think we've all come across somebody that is so stubborn that no matter what you tell them, no matter what information you throw at them, or you expose them to different ideas, they're stuck in their ways. They're this is the way I do things, this is the way that they are, this is my reality, and nothing you say will change that from them. That's a habit. That's something that they learned, or they're just stubborn jackasses. Either way, our habits are very similar in that sense. Even if we do consider ourselves open-minded, we often default everything that we do to the lessons that were given to us. And if we practice a lesson over and over again, never questioning it, never breaking away from it, never breaking it down, deconstructing it, well, then won't we just default back to what we learned? And doesn't that usually give us a bit of a narrower scope on what the possibilities are? Because ultimately we're told, take this with you and make it your own. And we've talked about this on the show and how to make things your own. What are the ideas that go about it? But we don't spend enough time learning how to do that process. How do we break things down? How do we adapt something that we saw that looked really good, that worked for this one individual, but may not work for us because of our body type. Now, we can continue just beating our heads up against the wall and repeating the same moves over and over and over again until we finally click, until we finally get it, or we don't and we stop doing it. It seems like too many of an extreme, like either it's going to work, but it's going to take a long time, or it's not going to get anywhere near. And even Ron mentioned in the seminar, why spend so much time working on something that you're just not good at? It's not going to be ever great. It's going to be mediocre at best, because that's not your dominance. That's not what you're naturally capable of doing. So is it better to spend more time on the things that you naturally can do and then refine those and get really good at those things? Or do you work on your weaknesses? Do you work on the things that you're not very good at? Say if you're a righty, working on your left hand with a weapon because you might injure it. Sure, it's a good idea. But how much time and effort do you put into any one thing? And where's that cutoff? Where does it become detrimental? Where does it become useful? And honestly, I don't know. I have no idea. A lot of it, I guess, is trial and error. But the habit that we create is the one we repeat the most. So if we just repeat movements without any function of why, or reasoning behind why we're doing it, or even the idea that it might not work the way it was taught, so we need to think around it, then are we just repeating and creating a habit that locks us into doing something a certain way? Which brings back the question, at what point do you start branching out? And I guess that's going to be different for everyone. Some people early on, some people might take a longer time. Some people have to be completely disappointed with their art, and we've heard these stories of people who are now, names in the martial arts world that did something for so long and were so committed until they realized, wait, there's a better way. Or not so much that there's a better way, but this way isn't working for me anymore. Whatever the case for that individual, but they come to this epiphany that things have to change. Something has to change. And they revolutionize the way that they do it, and they become a name, and people start listening to them because it's so new and so different. But is it really? Or is it just the process of realizing this doesn't work for me, but this does? So now I'm going to develop what works for me. Just like Ron said, that became a natural thing for them. So they're going to work on that, and they're going to refine it, and they're going to get better at it. And to me, that just brings up the question, then how do we figure that out? How do we figure out what works for us, for our body type, for our size? And I definitely believe that these seminars do offer that venue where you can start figuring out those sort of questions. You try different things, you go out and do different things, you develop ideas, but ultimately you're guided by why you're trying to do it. If for a self-defense situation, we do have to consider, okay, what is your opponent doing? Which then we would frame that in, I'm learning these techniques, I'm learning these movements with a willing participant, a training partner, an instructor. They are giving me the things that I need so I can learn. And there is a place for that, definitely. But at what point, again, in your training, do you break away from that? At what point do you start asking, will this work with somebody that isn't willing to give me what I need, that isn't willing to throw the punch the way that all the other students throw a punch, who isn't my size, who isn't going to stop at one move? How would then I use what I'm learning now against that changing environment or that unknown environment? And can I? And if that's the case, if we start thinking in that way, can we develop then ideas, ways to break away from these movements before they become habits, before they become the thing that is so ingrained in us that no matter how much more we learn, we default back to it to the point where we don't see the most logical and basic ideas, the simplest things, that when we hear a grandmaster who spent decades figuring this out says it, it resonates so much with us because we're like, oh my God, that makes so much sense. But for someone like me, once something is said like that and it makes so much sense, I just feel stupid. Because it's like, oh wait, that's so obvious. How did I miss it? And it could be because I got so stuck on the default setting of what I was learning that I didn't even bother to think beyond that moment. Now, is this a viable way of training? I've seen it work. Is it something that everyone can adapt to? No, I don't think it can be. But I do believe that in essence, we all should strive to figure out how best we learn. Because you're the one taking the information, you're the one that's going to be in a fight if you need to use it. Not your instructor, not the guy that taught him, not your students, not your fellow classmates, you. So it has to work for you. And in that sense, is it valuable enough to ask yourselves these questions? To wonder, to explore, to figure out what works best for you. Not for the sake of the title or the name of the individual that taught you, but simply because you want it to be useful. You want it to be effective. And what works for you, it's not going to work for somebody else. And what works for that person may not work for you, and that's okay. We give ourselves that leniency of failure, because once we do, especially in a controlled environment like a class, like a dojo, then we also have the ability to learn from it and grow from it. Because the worst thing you could do is try it out in real life and find out then that that shit doesn't work. Because that's a whole different topic and a lot of pain. But even if it does work, does it necessarily mean it's going to work every single time? Maybe, maybe not. But whatever it is that you figure out for yourself, work on it, refine it. And then, even when you're really, really good at it, question it again. Because the other part of every single fight, and a lot of training seems to miss, is the fact that that other person doesn't know what you know. Doesn't punch the way that your classmates or your other students punch. Isn't going to stay there and let you do whatever it is that you're trying to do. So what are the elements you need to then refine to be able to adapt to someone who you have no idea what they do, don't do, can't do, and may or may not give you any warning when they attack you? Because isn't that what we train for? Worst case scenario, somebody who's attacking you that out of the blue, that you didn't instigate, because we're good martial artists and we don't start shit, but we certainly finish it, or at least that's the idea. And where do you go from there? So just questions that came up because of somebody said something intriguing, somebody who I respect, who has years of training under them, who is a dynamic dude who, if you can see him, I definitely recommend you go to his next seminar, because he has a lot of wisdom to offer, and a lot of it is less about the movements and more about what's going on up here. What are you thinking about? What's your opponent thinking of doing? So just questions, ideas, concepts to mull over. How do you guys train? How do you guys break away from your traditional stuff, which is important? You need that base. And like Dennis Duarte say, we need to hold the traditions and carry them over to the next generation. But if we want to be effective, seems that we need to break away from it enough to understand why we're doing it in the first place. What does it mean in real life when it doesn't work the way that it was taught? And how do we make it better? Personally, if you can learn how you learn, in other words, understand how you process information, it's going to take you leaps and bounds ahead to understand what you really need to know or want to know. So, thank you for joining me on another one of Nain Short. I do appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. and I'll catch you on the next one. So, as usual, 3, 2, 1, cut!